Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. One of the most crippling mind states is that of fear. That fear paralyzes the mind and destroys any kind of serenity and wisdom, and makes everything more difficult. A lot of the stories about beings attaining to various stages of awakening, or just generally struggles in the Dhamma, revolve around fear. There's Ajahn story in his early practice about the nights he spent in a cemetery, and how terrified he was of ghosts and just generally the whole atmosphere. And there's of course the story of the Buddha on the night of his awakening being confronted by all the armies of Mara, and conjured up every kind of ferocious apparition and scared away all the devas. So the Buddha was left alone without protection, and he was not shaken from his resolve. He did not succumb to fear. It wasn't always like that for him. Earlier on in his practice as a bodhisattva, he recounts one story about how when he was practicing in the forest, every time he heard a twig break, he would become terrified, thinking it was a tiger or some other ferocious animal. This is a kind of scenario. It sounds slightly comical, but it's something that many people experience even in modern times in forests. And I've heard them joke at Bayagiri about the ferocious man-eating squirrels. People sometimes stay in tents there and they hear noise, because there are mountain lions there, so there is some cougars, so there is some legitimate grounds for apprehension, but people hear scuttering in the leaves and they're always convinced it's something ferocious. And fear confuses the mind and makes it play tricks. I think it's another kind of common thing. People walking in the forest when it's half light and it's at dawn or dusk, and every sort of stump or half-seen shape is a bear. This is another kind of common thing. Overcoming fear is quite essential for making progress. Succumbing to fear blocks you in many ways. It's first of all important to not give in to fear and face down that which you were afraid of. In that sutta that I alluded to briefly before, where the Buddha said when he was practicing before his awakening and he was in the forest and he was afraid of noises and animals and things, and he got through that fear by determining in his mind not to give in to it. And he said, wherever this fear and trembling arises, if it arises while I am sitting, I shall continue sitting until it passes. If it arises while I am walking, I will continue walking until it passes. So this is a first principle of dealing with fear is not to run away from it. The impulse is that by changing postures one can escape the situation. But the fear follows you. So remaining steadfast in the face of fear, and not giving up the sitting posture, not giving up the walking posture. You continue until the fear subsides. I can recount once when I was a young monk in Thailand. Ajahn gave a talk on this topic, and afterwards I asked him the question, is that valid for all the defilements or just for fear? And he thought about it for a minute, and he says, no, I don't think it would work universally. You can't say, I'm going to just lie here until the sloth and torpor passes away. So it's a particular admonition for fear. Would also say the same advice would apply to restlessness, that restlessness arises, don't change posture. That's very important, is to remain still. With fear, the idea is to face it down. And there are many stories of the forest monks of Thailand, the Tudong monks, deliberately meditating in lonely places, remote places like caves and things where tigers might be present, and as a way of facing fear. There is a sutta, the Abhaya Sutta, where the Buddha talks about fear and fearlessness. Bhaya is fear and Abhaya is fearlessness, and this mudra with the hand raised, this is the fearlessness, or the Abhaya mudra. In this sutta, the Buddha talks about 4 types of persons that are afraid of death, which is a root fear. One of the most fundamental fears is the fear of death. And he said that those who are full of passion and attachment to sensual desire fear death, because then when a illness comes upon them that looks like it might be terminal, they have the thought in their mind, oh no, I'm going to lose all my beloved sensual desires. I'll never get to do all those wonderful things I wanted to do. I'll never finish my bucket list. And this is fear of sensual desire, fear of loss becomes the basis for the fear of death in this case. Another type of person is greatly attached to the physical body, and when there's illness and possibility of death, the person becomes afraid, oh, well, my body will be no more, my beloved body will be destroyed. A third type of person is one who has lived heedlessly and immorally. So when death comes close, they have the fear of death because they realize they haven't made any good karma, and they're going to a bad destination. It's said in the Visuddhimagga, it talks about the dying process, and it says that when one gets close to death, one has visions of your destination, their next rebirth. And I had a conversation once some years ago with a Buddhist woman who worked in a palliative care. She was a palliative care nurse, and she had seen dozens, maybe hundreds of people die over the years. And she said that when they get close to death, some of them get very peaceful, and actually, if they've been suffering and unhappy before, they become peaceful and happy, and they die easily. And some of them become terrified and clinging to life, and just full of unpleasant mental states and agonies of mind, and she attributes that to their sense of their destination, where they're going. If the person realizes, I've lived a moral life and ethical life, and I've made good karma, even if they don't have that articulate understanding of it, they have that intuitive sense, then they can die happily. But if they've realized how many people they've wronged and how much evil they've done in the world, then they feel terrified at the moment of death. And the fourth kind of person the Buddha mentions who has a fear of death is one who has no confidence in the Dhamma. That the uncertainty and confusion in the mind becomes unbearable at the end. You have no context or frame, no sense to put things in. And I think this applies to some degree to followers of other religions as well. There is a distinction the Buddha makes in belief systems, is that they'll have a positive effect on the person as long as they have a belief in the consequence of actions. So someone who's a believing Christian, they do have a belief in the consequence of actions. They think that their state after death is determined by their actions in this life. So they can die with some sense of peace if they've lived a moral life, as they think they're going to a better place. So I don't think it necessarily means you have to exactly understand the death process the way that the Buddhists do, but you have to have a sense that there is some consequence, and there is some continuation. The consciousness will arise again, and it's dependent upon your actions in this life. Overcoming completely the fear of death, eradicating it utterly, only comes with awakening. And the abandonment, the transcending of the idea of self. Because all fear, not only the fear of death, but all kinds of fear, revolves around self-reference. That there is an idea and an attachment to a sense of self that's felt as very precious and under threat in some way. And this kind of fear can also arise to one who's attached to the idea of self. This kind of fear can arise upon hearing the Dhamma. It can feel threatening. This is mentioned by the Buddha in some cases when he teaches not self, that there'll be some individuals who become afraid and tremble and cry out, "Oh no, this self of mine shall be destroyed," because they misapprehend the Buddha's teaching, that there's no self to destroy in the first place. Likewise is said when the Buddha teaches the Devas. Most of them are afraid because they've never contemplated the possibility of death. It's such a remote concept to them. They have lifespans measured in human terms of millions of years. And then contemplating death suddenly becomes very terrifying to them. So how do we deal with fear in our own practice? There's different ways of dealing with when fear arises. As I said, having a grounding in not self is the real sovereign remedy, and the more you can approach that, the less fear you will have. But when fear arises, one of the first principles that helps is mindfulness, and particularly the aspect of staying in the present moment. As fear is often a projection into the future, thinking of what is going to happen in the future, what might happen. But if you're simply here now, present moment, then there's no ground for fear. You can observe this in the mind when you're in some unpleasant situation, something that is either physically painful or emotionally painful. What happens in the mind is a projection into the future, thinking about how long this is going to go on. When will this end? I can't bear this. But if you can just stay in the present moment, you can bear anything for a moment. It's just a single moment. You're not accumulating suffering that has not yet occurred. Another way to deal with fear more generally is development of the Brahma Viharas, particularly metta, the meditation of loving kindness or benevolence. May all beings be well and happy. When you ground yourself in metta, when metta is very strong, there's no fear of other beings. And it has an effect that is external to oneself, that the outer world then becomes more benevolent towards you. It's said in the Visuddhimagga that amongst the benefits of metta is that one who has deep enough metta is immune to fire and sword and like that. And there's various stories about someone established in metta and some evil person throws boiling oil on them and it just washes off like cool water and this kind of thing. Who's to say if with great psychic powers? But I'm inclined in more cases to interpret it as if one is established in metta, then you disarm the opponent with loving kindness, and they're not going to throw the boiling oil. They won't be able to. And there's many stories, incidents of this that are known to monks in the Thai forest tradition of wild animals, like the monk who a tiger was going to attack him, and he thought to himself that if I'm going to die, I want to die with my mind in a good place. I'll die with my mind established in metta, because he was a great practitioner of metta. So he went into jhana on metta, and when he opened his eyes, the tiger was gone. There was no harm done. There's a story in Ajahn Mun's biography of one of the monks in his group that had done a long walking pilgrimage from Thailand into India to the holy places. And unfortunately for him, on his way back to Thailand, World War II broke out. And Thailand was on the Japanese side, and Burma, of course, was a British colony. What happened was that he was captured by English soldiers, and knowing he was Thai, they took him for a spy. And they sent these spies in dressed as monks to wander around. And they decided to shoot him. But then he established himself in metta, and they couldn't do it. They had the guns pointed and they couldn't pull the trigger, they let them go. So I think even on a more trivial scale, I think a lot of people have observed that when they practice metta regularly, that other people start to become friendlier and more benevolent to them. And they're not meeting so much anger and hostility in the outer world. And there's no place in the heart of metta that's expansive. There's no place for fear. It's not a state that's compatible with fear. So mindfulness and metta meditation. Another one is maranasati, contemplation of death. Particularly for overcoming fear of death, is not to avoid the topic, but the Buddha recommends that we remind ourselves every day that I too shall die, that there's no escape from death for me. The idea of maranasati is just a contemplation more than a meditation. It's just to bring up the thought, the knowledge, to make it real and visceral for yourself that yes, I too shall die. My time here is limited, and I don't know when I'm going to die, I don't know how I'm going to die, but I know that eventually I will. And this is something that actually has to be developed to some degree. On a very superficial level, everybody says, oh yeah, of course I know I'm going to die. But no one, I shouldn't say no one, but most people don't make it real for themselves. They avoid it. And it always strikes me as funny when I hear somebody say, if I die. I thought, there's this old woman who's well up in her 90s. She didn't quite make it to 100. She died when she was 99. Now, she was in her 90s. She would go. Her son was a big meditator at IMS, and he got her to go with him for some retreats. And she was actually going to retreats in her 90s. And Ajahn Amaro gave a talk on impermanence, and she told him after the retreat, that was a really powerful talk you gave, Ajahn. It made me think one day I might die. So, I mean, this is kind of very common in the world. And at the moment of a crisis or a danger, and fear is overwhelming in the mind, and taking refuge in Punnadhammo Sangha is very important. And this is something that is particularly recommended if the fear has to do with like the supernatural, which if one is afraid of ghosts or spooks of some kind, then taking refuge in Punnadhammo Sangha, chanting, doing parita chants, the Tipiso or any other parita chant, or just repeating Punnadhammo Sangha, or chanting the Karaniya Metta Sutta. This kind of thing is very helpful in dissipating these kind of dark fears. And I'd like to also say something about a particular fear that's a big hindrance in meditation, and it's not the type of a hindrance that's a beginner's problem so much as intermediate or late stages, and the mind is very calm and clear, and the meditation is proceeding. Fear can arise of making that final step, of stepping out into the void. And it can be very subtle, but it's an overwhelming block.
that one has to abandon attachment to existence and non-existence. One has to just go where the spirit leads, so to speak. There's an image in the tarot cards. In one particular version of the tarot cards, the Fool is shown, which is the 0 card, is shown dressed in motley, like the Harlequins, this kind of raggedy clown suit. And he's carrying his possessions in a stick over his shoulder, in a little bag on the end of a stick. And he's merrily stepping over a cliff as his eyes are focused on a butterfly. This is the state of mind to cultivate. Follow the butterfly. Never mind the cliff. Never mind the abyss. This is a serious issue that has to be dealt with. Some Dhamma teachers, Ajahn Mun I think was an example, but there are others, cultivate a persona and a reputation for ferocity, and their students are terrified of them. And one explanation I heard from this is the idea is the student becomes more afraid of the teacher than of the abyss. So they're so afraid of the disapproval of the teacher that they flee into the abyss. You still have to summon up that internal courage. There's a saying, I can't remember where it comes from, but I've always liked it, is the way out is down and through. And there's a motif that shows up in folk tales and legends around the world of the hero's quest type. There's often near the end of the quest, there's a dark cavern, or you have to go under a bridge or something, and there's a ferocious dragon or other kind of monster guarding that passage. And this dragon has to be slain. This is the courage has to be found. In the spiritual passage, courage is absolutely essential. And at the last moment, you could almost say it has to be a reckless sort of courage. The one just plunges forward, irregardless. At that moment, you can't have any reliance on the things of the world that you've depended on up to that point. Everything's fallen away, even your personality and your views and opinions. You have to just abandon it all. Proceed forward. You can't let fear stand in your way. You can't let fear hinder you. And you see this on a mundane level. When you're overcome by fear, then you become helpless. We have the kind of trope of the deer in the headlights. It's too afraid to move. It gets schmucked. And this is the situation often in life, is that fear prevents us from coping with difficult situations. We have to find the courage to do what is necessary. Jump out of the headlights. Even though it's scary as hell right at the moment, you still have to do it. So, I'll stop there.